And it's our responsibility to obey them, is it not? That's the way the creator-creature relationship works. He is supreme. He is the authority. He's teaching Adam and us the need for us to subject ourselves and submit ourselves to His rule as our Creator. So He singles out this one tree and says, this tree is exclusively mine. You can't eat of this tree. And it's through this one prohibition that Adam was to be exercised in the spiritual discipline of obedience. This was the one point at which he was called upon by God to submit to God's law and God's command and just simply, without question, obey God. And here's the kicker. You remember my statements about the prohibition of eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? God's not withholding the knowledge of good and evil from Adam, because that's clearly taught as a principle throughout Scripture that should mark the people of God. Guys, this is huge. This is huge. Don't miss what I'm saying here. Adam was to learn to discern between good and evil purely on the basis of his obedience to God's command. Let me repeat what I just said. It is precisely by Adam's obedience that he was to gain knowledge of good and evil and be able to discern and make distinction between them. Now, what does that do? Who does that make the arbiter and the decider of what is good and evil? It makes God the arbiter of good and evil, does it not? And Adam learns from his Creator, by obedience to his Creator's command, what is good and what is evil. That was what was represented in that tree there. So what constitutes good? On the basis of understanding that, what constitutes good in God's creation? That which is in subjection to His commandments. If God has commanded it, then that is good. What constitutes sin in God's creation? Anything that lacks conformity to the command of God. Do you see that principle there? Do you see that principle there? Now I want to carry you back into the Scripture here, and let's work this out and see how this works out. Adam was to gain wisdom and knowledge to be able to discern between good and evil, not by some eating a magical fruit, but he was to learn those things and gain that wisdom and knowledge through obedience to God. How does that work itself out in Scripture? Remember the book of Deuteronomy is Moses giving his final instruction to the inheriting generation that's going to go in and take the land of Canaan. And remember what God reminds them of in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 6. He says, keep them. What is he talking about? Keep the commands and the laws of your God and do them. And look at the next statement. It's unmistakable, isn't it? For that will be your wisdom and your understanding. Now wait a minute. He's talking about obedience. How does that translate into wisdom and understanding? It translates, Melissa, into wisdom and understanding because it's obedience to the infinite, wise, and knowledgeable God. It's acknowledging that He is God and He alone arbitrates what is good and what is evil, and we gain wisdom and knowledge of that by simply obeying what He has commanded us to do. We are utterly dependent creatures on our Creator, are we not? He says that your obedience will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people who, when they hear these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. On what basis were they to be viewed a wise and understanding people? The basis of their obedience. And that was to be, don't miss this, their witness. That was to be their testimony before the nations, that we obey the commands of the Creator of the heavens and the earth. Go on further into Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning with verse 2. Moses said, and you shall remember the whole way the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that He might humble you, testing them for what? Obedience. What was He doing with Adam in the garden with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? But testing Adam that he would obey the commands of his God. To know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commands or not. And He humbled you, and He let you hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know, don't miss this, that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. What is He saying? What is He saying? Your testing in the wilderness was to teach you that your life has its very essence in obedience to the words of your God. Outside of that obedience, you have no life. You live by the word of your God. This is why ancient Job makes the statement, I consider the words of your mouth, Lord, more necessary than what? My daily food. Why were they necessary? Because in obedience to those commands and those words, Job understood that he had an abundance of life. And that was what God was teaching the nation of Israel in the wilderness. Look at David's statements in Psalm 119, beginning with verse 98. He says of the Lord, Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is ever with me. I have more understanding than my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the aged, for I keep your precepts. What is David's wisdom and understanding, and what is his wisdom and understanding and knowledge based on? The Word, the commands, the precepts of his God. You see, this principle literally saturates the Old Testament. So your next bullet point, it was precisely by Adam's obedience to God's prohibitive commandment not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that Adam would gain knowledge and wisdom and understanding. It was by his obedience that he gained the very thing that we often, almost mistakenly, think God was keeping from him. But in actuality, God was giving him wisdom and understanding in spades, as we would say. But God pronounced a judgment in connection with this prohibition. He pronounced a judgment in connection with this prohibition. You shall not eat of that tree, but in the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely what? Die. The judgment is vitally connected to the commandment. And every one of us is going to sit here and say, well, I know that. But do we? Do we live it? Is it a part of us? Disobedience will result